Toddler discovered a German Shepherd, locked in a billboard frame, 15 feet high. What he did next was incredible. What happened next will shock you and change everything you thought you knew about the power of a child's innocent heart. Like this story, share it with your friends, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from. The rain hammered against the windows of the small house on Maple Street like bullets from the sky. 5-year-old Ethan pressed his tiny palms against the cold glass, watching the storm tear through their quiet neighborhood. His breath fogged the window as he whispered to himself, counting the seconds between lightning and thunder like his dad had taught him. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi. The thunder crashed. The storm was getting closer. His mother Sarah called from the kitchen, her voice cutting through the howling wind. "Ethan, come away from the window, honey. This storm is getting nasty." But Ethan didn't move. Something was wrong. Something was calling to him from outside, beyond the rain and wind. His small ears picked up a sound that made his heart race, a sound that shouldn't exist in a storm like this. "Mama," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the weather. "Mama, there's a dog crying." Sarah looked up from the dishes she was washing, water dripping from her hands. "What did you say, sweetheart?" "A dog," Ethan said louder, his voice trembling. "A big dog is crying up high in the sky." Sarah dried her hands on a kitchen towel and walked over to her son. The storm outside was fierce, with wind strong enough to bend trees and rain so heavy it looked like a gray curtain had been dropped over the world. She knelt beside Ethan and looked out the window, seeing nothing but the chaos of nature. "Honey, I don't hear any dog. It's probably just the wind making strange sounds. You know how storms can sound scary sometimes." But Ethan shook his head, his dark eyes wide with certainty. "No, Mama, it's not the wind. It's a dog, and he's scared. He's crying because he can't get down." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm. Her 5-year-old son had always been different, more sensitive than other children his age. He heard things others couldn't hear, saw things others missed. The pediatrician had said it was normal. Some children were just more perceptive. But this was different. This felt urgent. "Where do you think you hear this dog, baby?" Ethan pointed toward the massive digital billboard that stood like a steel giant across the street from their house. The billboard usually displayed bright advertisements for cars and restaurants, but today it flickered and sparked in the storm, its lights fighting against the wind and rain. "Up there," Ethan said, his finger pressed against the glass. "He's stuck up there, Mama. He's scared and he can't get down." Sarah looked at the billboard, squinting through the rain. It was at least 15 feet high, maybe more. The very idea of a dog being up there seemed impossible. But as she watched, something caught her eye. A shadow moved behind the steel frame, something that didn't belong. "Ethan, stay right here," she said, her voice suddenly serious. "Don't move from this spot." She ran to the kitchen and grabbed her phone, calling her neighbor across the street. Mrs. Chen had lived in the neighborhood for 30 years and knew everything that happened on their block. "Mrs. Chen, it's Sarah. I know this sounds crazy, but do you see anything strange about the billboard across from my house?" There was a pause. "You mean the one that's been flickering all morning? I thought it was just the storm messing with the electricity." "No, I mean, do you see anything moving up there, behind the display?" Another pause, longer this time. "Sarah, now that you mention it, there has been something odd. I saw what looked like a maintenance truck there yesterday evening, but it was gone by this morning. And there's been a sound. I thought it was just the wind, but..." Sarah's heart started racing. What kind of sound? Like crying or whimpering. I dismissed it because it seemed impossible, but Sarah, you don't think there's actually something up there, do you? Before Sarah could answer, Ethan's voice rose to a near scream from the living room. "Mama! Mama, he's trying to get out! The dog is trying to get out, but he's stuck!" Sarah dropped the phone and rushed back to the window. Ethan was pressed against the glass, his small hands flat against the surface, tears streaming down his face. "Please, Mama," he whispered. "Please help him. He's so scared." Sarah looked up at the billboard again, and this time she saw it clearly. Between the steel beams that supported the digital display, something was moving, something brown and furry, trapped in the narrow space behind the screen. As she watched, a paw appeared, then disappeared again, like an animal trying desperately to find a way out. "Oh my God," she breathed. "Ethan, you're right. There's actually a dog up there." The sound hit her then. carried on the wind between the crashes of thunder. It was faint, but unmistakable, the desperate whining of a terrified animal. A dog trapped 15 feet in the air, in a storm that was getting worse by the minute. Sarah's mind raced. How had a dog gotten up there? And more importantly, how were they going to get it down? "Mama, we have to save him," Ethan said, his voice breaking. "We have to save him right now." Sarah picked up her phone and dialed 911, her hands shaking as she watched the animal struggle in its impossible prison. "911, what's your emergency?" "This is going to sound crazy, but there's a dog trapped in a billboard frame, about 15 feet off the ground. I don't know how it got there, but it's alive, and it's in distress." There was a pause. "Ma'am, can you repeat that?" "A dog, a large dog from what I can see. It's trapped in the steel frame behind the digital billboard on Maple Street. It's been there since at least yesterday, and with this storm—" "Ma'am, I'm going to need to transfer you to animal control. Please hold." As Sarah waited on hold, she watched her son press his face against the window, his breath fogging the glass as he whispered to the trapped animal as if it could hear him. "It's okay, doggy. Don't be scared. We're going to help you. I promise we're going to help you." The rain continued to pound against their house, and the wind howled like a living thing. But through it all, Sarah could now hear what her son had heard from the beginning, the desperate cries of an animal that shouldn't exist, trapped in a place that seemed impossible. When animal control finally came on the line, their response was not what she had hoped for. "Ma'am, we're dealing with multiple emergencies due to the storm. We have flooding throughout the county, and our rescue teams are handling life-threatening situations. A dog and a billboard, well, that's not something we can respond to immediately." "But it's been there since yesterday," Sarah said, her voice rising. "And this storm is getting worse. The animal could die up there." "I understand your concern, but we simply don't have the resources right now. I'll put it on our list, but it could be several hours, maybe even tomorrow, before we can get someone out there." Sarah hung up the phone, feeling helpless. She looked at Ethan, who was still standing at the window, his small body trembling with emotion. "What did they say, Mama?" They said they can't come right now, baby. They're too busy with the storm." Ethan turned to face her, and Sarah saw something in her son's eyes that she had never seen before. It wasn't just sadness or disappointment. It was determination. "Then we have to save him ourselves," Ethan said, his voice steady despite his tears. "We can't let him die up there, Mama. We just can't." Sarah looked back at the billboard, where the dog's desperate movements were becoming weaker. The animal was losing hope, and time was running out. "Honey, we can't get up there. It's too high and too dangerous." "But what about Jake?" Ethan asked suddenly. "Jake climbs everything. He could do it." Sarah's heart skipped. Jake was her 17-year-old nephew, her sister's son, who had been living with them since his parents died in a car accident 2 years ago. Jake was into parkour, always climbing buildings and jumping between rooftops, much to Sarah's constant worry. She had always seen his hobby as dangerous and reckless. Now, it might be their only hope. "Jake's at school, honey, and even if he were here, I couldn't ask him to do something so dangerous." "But Mama," Ethan said, his voice growing urgent, "the dog is going to die. I can hear it in his voice. He's giving up." Sarah looked at the billboard again. The movement had indeed slowed, and the whimpering was becoming weaker. The storm was getting stronger, and the animal was losing its battle against exhaustion and fear. She made a decision that would change everything. "Ethan, go get my car keys. We're going to get Jake." As they prepared to leave, Sarah took one last look at the billboard. The dog was still there, still trapped, still fighting for its life. But now she could see something else, something that made her blood run cold. Around the animal's neck was a collar, and attached to that collar was something that glinted in the stormy light. It wasn't a regular dog tag. It was something else, something that didn't belong on a lost pet. Something that suggested this animal's presence in the billboard wasn't an accident at all. "Mama, hurry," Ethan said, pulling on her hand. "He's getting weaker. We have to hurry." Sarah grabbed her keys and followed her son to the car, her mind racing with questions that had no answers. How had the dog gotten up there? Why was it wearing what looked like some kind of electronic device? And most importantly, if this wasn't an accident, who had put it there? As they drove through the storm toward Jake's school, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were about to uncover something much bigger and more dangerous than a simple animal rescue. The dog in the billboard was just the beginning, and her 5-year-old son, with his innocent heart and sharp ears, had just stumbled upon a secret that someone had gone to great lengths to hide. The storm raged on, but inside their car, Sarah and Ethan were driven by a purpose that was stronger than any weather, the need to save a life, no matter what the cost. What they didn't know was that their rescue mission would soon put them in the crosshairs of one of the most powerful and dangerous men in the city, a man who would stop at nothing to keep his secrets buried. The dog in the billboard was just the first piece of a puzzle that would test their courage, their faith, and their very survival. But for now, all that mattered was getting to Jake and convincing him to attempt the impossible, scaling a 15-foot billboard in the middle of a storm to save an animal that had somehow found its way into the most unlikely prison imaginable. The rain continued to fall, washing away the normal world and replacing it with something darker, more dangerous, and infinitely more mysterious. Ethan pressed his face against the car window, looking back at the billboard as they drove away. Even from a distance, he could still hear the dog's cries, carried on the wind like a prayer for help. "Hold on, doggy," he whispered. "We're coming back for you, I promise." And in that moment, the 5-year-old boy made a promise that would change not just his life, but the lives of everyone he loved. The storm was just beginning, and so was their fight for the truth. The drive to Riverside High School took longer than usual. The storm had turned the familiar streets into rivers, and Sarah had to navigate around fallen branches and flooding. Every minute felt like an hour as they fought their way through the chaos, knowing that somewhere behind them, a desperate animal was fighting for its life. "Mama, what if Jake says no?" Ethan asked from the back seat, his voice small and worried. Sarah caught his eyes in the rearview mirror. "He won't say no, honey. Jake has a good heart, just like you do." But even as she said it, Sarah wasn't sure. Jake had become distant since moving in with them, carrying the weight of his parents' death like a stone in his chest. He threw himself into his parkour training, scaling buildings and jumping between rooftops as if he were trying to escape something that could never be outrun. Would he risk his life for a dog he'd never met? They pulled into the school parking lot just as the final bell rang. Students poured out of the building, running through the rain to waiting cars and buses. Sarah spotted Jake immediately. Tall, lean, with the same dark hair as Ethan, but older, more guarded. He was walking alone, as usual, his backpack slung over one shoulder. "Jake!" Sarah called out, rolling down her window. "Jake! Over here!" He looked up, surprised to see them. His face immediately showed concern as he jogged over to the car, rain soaking through his jacket. "Aunt Sarah, what's wrong? Why aren't you guys at home?" "Get in the car," Sarah said urgently. "We need your help with something." Jake slid into the passenger seat, shaking rain from his hair. "What's going on? You look like you've seen a ghost." "There's a dog," Ethan said from the back seat before Sarah could speak. "A big dog stuck in the billboard by our house. He's been there since yesterday, and he's scared and he can't get down." Jake turned to look at his younger cousin, his eyebrows raised. "A dog? In a billboard?" "I know it sounds crazy," Sarah said, pulling out of the parking lot. "But it's real. Ethan heard it first, and when I looked, I could see it moving behind the display screen. It's trapped in the steel frame, about 15 feet up." As they drove back toward the house, Sarah explained everything. The storm, the animal control's refusal to respond, the strange electronic device she'd noticed on the dog's collar. Jake listened quietly, his expression growing more serious with each detail. "And you want me to climb up there and get it down," he said finally. It wasn't a question. "The fire department is dealing with flooding emergencies," Sarah explained. "Animal control can't come until tomorrow at the earliest. Jake, that dog is going to die up there if we don't do something." Jake was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the storm. "It's dangerous, Aunt Sarah. That billboard is slippery on a good day, and with this rain and wind." "I know," Sarah said softly. "I know I'm asking a lot, but Jake, you're the only person I know who might be able to do this. And that animal, it's suffering." "Please, Jake," Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I can hear how scared he is. I can hear him giving up." Jake turned to look at his cousin, and Sarah saw something shift in his expression. For the first time in 2 years, the wall he'd built around his heart seemed to crack just a little. "Okay," he said quietly. Let's go take a look." When they arrived back at the house, the storm had intensified. The wind was howling like a living thing, and the rain was coming down in sheets so thick they could barely see the billboard across the street. But the dog was still there, still moving, still fighting. Jake stood at the living room window, studying the structure with the calculating eye of someone who understood the physics of climbing. Sarah watched him, seeing the gears turning in his mind as he assessed angles, distances, and grip points. "The steel frame has cross beams," he said finally. "I can use those for handholds. The biggest problem is going to be the rain. Everything's going to be slippery as hell." "Jake, maybe we should wait," Sarah said, suddenly having second thoughts. "Maybe the storm will pass and—" "No," Jake said firmly. "Look at it." Sarah looked at the billboard again, and her heart sank. The dog's movements were becoming weaker, more sporadic. The animal was losing its battle against exhaustion and fear. "If we wait, it's going to die," Jake said simply. "I can do this, Aunt Sarah. I've climbed taller things in worse conditions." "When?" Sarah asked, alarmed. Jake gave her a small smile, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him in months. "You don't want to know." He went to his room and came back with a backpack full of climbing gear, ropes, carabiners, and a harness that looked like it had seen plenty of use. As he suited up, Sarah felt a mixture of pride and terror watching her nephew prepare to risk his life for an animal he'd never met. "I'm going to need help," Jake said, checking his equipment. "I can get up there, but getting the dog down is going to be tricky. It's going to be scared, maybe injured. I might need to lower it down in stages." "What can we do?" Sarah asked. "Get some thick blankets and rope. If the dog is hurt, we'll need to make a sling to get it down safely. And Sarah—" Jake paused, his expression serious. "If something goes wrong up there, if I fall or get hurt, you call 911 immediately. Don't try to help me, just call for help." Sarah nodded, her throat tight with fear. "Jake, are you sure about this?" "I'm sure," he said, shouldering his pack. "Let's go save a dog." They crossed the street together, fighting against the wind and rain. Up close, the billboard looked even more imposing, a steel giant that seemed to stretch impossibly high into the stormy sky. The dog was clearly visible now, a large German shepherd wedged between the crossbeams behind the flickering display screen. The animal saw them approaching and let out a pitiful whine, pressing itself against the steel frame as if trying to get closer to help. "Easy, boy," Jake called up. "We're going to get you down. Just hold on." He began his ascent, moving with the fluid grace of someone who had spent years learning to read the language of metal and stone. Even in the storm, even with the rain making everything treacherous, he moved with confidence and purpose. Sarah held her breath as she watched him climb higher, each movement taking him further from safety. Ethan stood beside her, his small hand gripping hers tightly. "He's doing it, Mama," Ethan whispered. "He's actually doing it." Jake reached the first crossbeam, then the second. The dog watched him approach, its tail wagging weakly, a sign of hope that brought tears to Sarah's eyes. "That's it, buddy," Jake called softly. "I'm coming to get you." But as Jake reached the final crossbeam, something went wrong. The dog suddenly became agitated, pressing itself further back into the frame, whimpering and shaking its head as if trying to warn Jake away. "What's wrong with it?" Sarah called up. Jake had reached the dog now, and Sarah could see him examining the animal, his hands moving carefully over its body. After a moment, he called down to them, his voice tight with anger. "This dog didn't get up here by accident," he shouted over the wind. "It's been tied up here. There are rope marks on its legs, and this collar— Sarah, this collar isn't normal. It's got some kind of electronic device built into it." Sarah felt her blood turn to ice. "What kind of device?" "I don't know, but it's not a regular dog tag. It looks like some kind of camera or recording device." Jake worked quickly, using a pocket knife to cut through the restraints that had held the dog prisoner. The animal was weak but alert, its eyes showing intelligence and gratitude as Jake freed it from its impossible cage. "I'm going to lower him down now," Jake called. "Get those blankets ready." The descent was even more dangerous than the climb up. Jake had to support the weight of a 60-pound dog while navigating the slippery steel frame in hurricane-force winds. The dog, which Jake had started calling Max, seemed to understand that it needed to stay still and trust the young man who was risking his life to save it. Inch by inch, they made their way down. Sarah and Ethan waited below with blankets and rope, ready to catch the dog if something went wrong. The wind howled around them, and the rain stung their faces like needles. Finally, Jake reached the bottom crossbeam. He lowered Max into Sarah's waiting arms, and she caught the trembling animal, wrapping it in blankets and whispering words of comfort. Jake dropped to the ground a moment later, breathing hard and soaked to the skin. But he was smiling, really smiling, for the first time since his parents' death. "We did it," he said, looking at the dog in Sarah's arms. "We actually did it." Max looked up at them with eyes that seemed to hold intelligence far beyond that of a normal dog. Despite his ordeal, there was something alert and aware in his gaze, as if he understood exactly what had just happened. "Let's get inside," Sarah said. "We need to get Max warm and dry, and figure out what that device on his collar is." As they hurried across the street, Sarah noticed something that made her pause. A black sedan was parked at the end of the block, its tinted windows making it impossible to see inside. She'd never seen the car before, and something about its presence made her skin crawl. "Jake," she said quietly, "do you see that car?" Jake looked where she was pointing, his expression growing wary. "Yeah, how long has it been there?" "I don't know, I just noticed it." They watched the sedan for a moment, but it didn't move. Finally, they hurried inside, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. In the warmth of their living room, Max began to relax. Ethan sat beside the dog, gently petting its head and whispering reassurances. The animal seemed to respond to the boy's touch, its breathing becoming less labored. "Look at this collar," Jake said, examining the electronic device more closely. "This isn't just a GPS tracker. It's got a camera and what looks like a memory card slot." Sarah knelt beside him, studying the device. "Why would someone put a camera on a dog?" "I don't know, but whoever did this, they went to a lot of trouble to hide Max up there. This wasn't random. This was planned." As if responding to his words, Max lifted his head and looked directly at Sarah. For a moment, she could have sworn the dog was trying to tell her something, trying to communicate some urgent message that she couldn't understand. "We need to call the police," she said finally. "This is evidence of animal cruelty and maybe something worse." But even as she said it, Sarah remembered the black sedan parked outside. If someone had been watching them, if someone knew they had rescued the dog, then calling the police might not be enough to protect them. Max seemed to sense her fear. The dog moved closer to Ethan, positioning itself between the boy and the door, as if it were already prepared to defend its rescuers. "Mama," Ethan said softly, "Max is trying to tell us something. He's scared of more than just being up high. He's scared of someone." Sarah looked at her son, then at the dog, then at the electronic device that had been hidden in plain sight on Max's collar. Whatever they had stumbled into, it was bigger than a simple animal rescue. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside their home, they had brought something dangerous. Not the dog, but the truth that the dog carried with it. What secrets had Max been forced to witness? And what lengths would someone go to in order to keep those secrets buried? The answers to those questions would change their lives forever, but for now, they were safe, warm, and together. The real danger was still to come. Tell me in the comments, what do you think is on that camera device? Your theories might be closer to the truth than you think. An hour later, Max was dry and fed, but something was wrong. The German Shepherd sat in the corner of the living room, refusing to eat the food Sarah had offered him. His eyes darted constantly toward the windows, and every time a car passed outside, his ears would perk up and his body would tense as if he were preparing to run. "He's scared," Ethan observed, sitting cross-legged on the floor near the dog. "He's not just hurt, he's terrified of something." Sarah watched the interaction between her son and the rescued animal. There was something almost supernatural about the way Ethan seemed to understand Max's emotions, as if they were communicating on a level that went beyond normal human-animal connection. "Jake, what did you see up there?" Sarah asked her nephew, who was sitting at the kitchen table, still toweling rain from his hair. "When you were cutting him free, did you notice anything else?" Jake's expression darkened. The rope marks weren't just on his legs, Aunt Sarah. Someone had tied him in a way that he couldn't move, couldn't escape, but could still see in all directions. And the collar. He gestured toward the electronic device they had removed from Max's neck. It was positioned so the camera would capture everything the dog was looking at. "Like surveillance," Sarah said, the pieces starting to come together in her mind. "Exactly like surveillance. But who uses a dog for surveillance? And what were they trying to record? Sarah picked up the small device, turning it over in her hands. It was more sophisticated than anything she'd ever seen. Compact, waterproof, with what looked like a high-definition camera lens and multiple ports for data transfer. "There's a memory card in here," she said, finding a small slot. "Maybe we can see what's on it." "Mama, be careful," Ethan said suddenly, his voice filled with an urgency that made both adults stop what they were doing. "Max doesn't want us to watch it. He's scared of what's on there." Sarah looked at the dog, and sure enough, Max was watching them intently, his body tense with anxiety. When she held up the device, the animal whimpered and took a step backward. "It's okay, boy," she said softly. "We're not going to hurt you, but we need to understand what happened to you." Jake had gone to his room and returned with his laptop. "Let's see what we're dealing with," he said, connecting the device to his computer. The memory card contained dozens of video files, each one time-stamped over the past several weeks. Sarah selected the most recent file and clicked play. The screen filled with a bird's-eye view of what appeared to be an industrial complex. The camera was moving slightly. Max had been walking or being moved, and the image quality was remarkably clear. Sarah could see warehouses, loading docks, and several black vehicles parked in organized rows. "Where is this?" Jake asked, leaning closer to the screen. "I don't know, but look at those buildings," Sarah said, pointing to a series of identical concrete structures. "They look like storage facilities or—" The image suddenly shifted as Max was apparently lifted or repositioned. Now the camera was pointing toward a loading dock, where several men were unloading what appeared to be cages from the back of a large truck. "Are those animal cages?" Jake asked, his voice tight with anger. Sarah's heart sank as she realized what they were looking at. "It's a puppy mill," she whispered, "or worse." But as they continued to watch, it became clear that this operation was much larger than a simple puppy mill. The men were moving the cages with military precision, and each cage was labeled with numbers and codes. More disturbing, some of the cages appeared to contain dogs that were already trained, dogs that sat quietly and followed commands despite being in a clearly stressful situation. "This isn't just breeding," Jake said grimly. "This is training. They're training these dogs for something specific." Sarah fast-forwarded through several files, each one showing different aspects of the operation. There were indoor facilities with rows upon rows of cages, training areas where dogs were put through complex obstacle courses, and what appeared to be a veterinary facility where the animals were being fitted with various electronic devices. "They're making an army of surveillance dogs," Sarah breathed. "But for what?" The answer came in the next video file. The timestamp showed it was recorded just 3 days ago, and the location appeared to be different, an upscale residential area with expensive homes and manicured lawns. "That's Riverside Heights," Jake said, recognizing the neighborhood. "That's where all the rich people live." In the video, Max was apparently positioned in bushes outside a large mansion. The camera captured several well-dressed men entering and leaving the house, their faces clearly visible. Sarah recognized one of them immediately, City Councilman Robert Hayes, a man she'd interviewed several times for her freelance journalism work. Why would someone want surveillance footage of Councilman Hayes? She wondered aloud. The answer became clear as they watched more files. The operation wasn't just about training dogs. It was about using those dogs to gather intelligence on powerful people throughout the city. Politicians, business leaders, judges, anyone with influence was being watched. "This is huge," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Someone is running a massive surveillance operation using trained dogs. But who and why?" Sarah was about to respond when Max suddenly jumped to his feet, his ears pricked and his body rigid with tension. A low growl rumbled in his throat as he stared toward the front door. "What is it, boy?" Ethan asked, moving closer to the dog. That's when they heard it, the sound of car doors closing outside. Sarah rushed to the window and felt her blood turn to ice. The black sedan was still there, but now there were 2 more cars parked alongside it. Men in dark clothing were getting out of the vehicles, and they were walking toward the house. "Jake, take Ethan and Max to the back room," Sarah said, her voice deadly calm. "Now." "What's happening, Mama?" Ethan asked, but his question was answered by a loud knock on the front door. "We know you have the dog," a voice called from outside. "We just want to talk." Sarah looked at the laptop screen, where the surveillance footage was still playing. She quickly ejected the memory card and slipped it into her pocket, then closed the laptop. "Take them to the basement," she whispered to Jake. "There's a door that leads to the neighbor's yard. If something happens to me, get out of there and call the police." "I'm not leaving you," Jake said firmly. "You have to protect Ethan," Sarah said. "And Max, that dog has evidence that could bring down whoever is behind this." Another knock, louder this time. "Mrs. Sarah Mitchell, we know you're in there. We represent a private security firm, and that animal is our property. We need to recover it immediately." Sarah's mind raced. How did they know her name? How did they know she had the dog? And most importantly, what were they willing to do to get Max back? "Mama, I'm scared," Ethan whispered, clinging to her leg. "It's going to be okay, baby," Sarah said, though she wasn't sure she believed it herself. "Jake, take him now." Jake scooped up Ethan and gestured for Max to follow. The dog hesitated for a moment, looking back at Sarah as if he wanted to stay and protect her. "Go, boy," she whispered. "Protect Ethan." Max seemed to understand. He turned and followed Jake and Ethan toward the back of the house, his training as a protection dog overriding his instinct to stay and fight. Sarah took a deep breath and walked to the front door. Through the peephole, she could see 3 men in expensive suits, but their faces were cold and professional. These weren't animal control officers. These were people accustomed to getting what they wanted through intimidation or force. "What do you want?" she called through the door. "Mrs. Mitchell, my name is Thomas Kane. I represent Apex Security Solutions. Earlier today, you interfered with our property recovery operation. We need that animal returned immediately." "I don't know what you're talking about," Sarah said, though her voice shook slightly. "I rescued a lost dog from a dangerous situation. If it belongs to someone, they can contact animal control." There was a pause, and Sarah could hear the men conferring in low voices. When Kane spoke again, his tone had changed. It was no longer polite or professional. "Mrs. Mitchell, I think there's been a misunderstanding. That animal is part of an ongoing federal investigation. By interfering with our operation, you've potentially compromised months of work and put yourself in serious legal jeopardy." "Federal investigation?" Sarah's mind reeled. If these men were federal agents, then everything she'd assumed about the surveillance operation might be wrong. But something didn't feel right about their story. "If you're federal agents, show me your badges," she called. "Mrs. Mitchell, we're not agents. We're private contractors working with federal agencies. The details are classified, but I assure you that you don't want to be on the wrong side of this." Sarah's journalist instincts kicked in. Private contractors claiming to work with federal agencies, sophisticated surveillance equipment, trained dogs being used to spy on city officials. This had all the hallmarks of a story much bigger than she'd initially thought. "I need to see official documentation," she said. "Until then, I'm not opening this door." She heard footsteps moving around the house. They were checking for other entrances. Sarah's heart pounded as she realized these men weren't going to simply leave if she refused to cooperate. Moving quickly, she grabbed her phone and started recording a voice memo, speaking quietly but clearly. "This is Sarah Mitchell, journalist, recording at 3:47 p.m. on November 15th. My family and I rescued a German Shepherd from what appeared to be an impossible situation. The dog was trapped in a billboard frame 15 feet off the ground. Upon examination, we discovered the animal was wearing sophisticated surveillance equipment and had been deliberately placed in that location. We've now been approached by men claiming to represent Apex Security Solutions, led by someone named Thomas Kane. They're demanding the return of what they call their property and making veiled threats about federal investigations. The dog was clearly being used for illegal surveillance of city officials, and I believe these men are involved in a conspiracy that goes much deeper than animal abuse." She stopped recording and quickly sent the file to her editor at the local newspaper, along with a text message, "Emergency. If something happens to me, investigate Apex Security Solutions and surveillance dogs, evidence in attached file." The knocking started again, more insistent this time. "Mrs. Mitchell, our patience is limited. Open the door, or we'll be forced to enter by other means." Sarah's blood ran cold. These men were threatening to break into her home. She called 911, but when the dispatcher answered, Kane's voice came from right outside the window beside her. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, Mrs. Mitchell. This is a matter of national security, and local police don't have jurisdiction here." How had he known she was calling the police? Sarah looked around frantically and spotted a small device attached to the window frame, some kind of listening device that hadn't been there before. "You're bugging my house," she said, more angry than afraid now. "We're monitoring the situation, yes. Mrs. Mitchell, you've stumbled into something much larger than you understand. That dog has been gathering intelligence on a terrorist cell operating in your city. By taking it, you've not only compromised our operation, but put yourself and your family in danger from very dangerous people." Sarah's mind raced. Was Kane telling the truth? Was the surveillance operation actually legitimate? But if that were the case, why had Max been hidden so carefully? Why hadn't they simply identified themselves as law enforcement from the beginning? If this is a legitimate operation, why was the dog tied up and abandoned in a storm? She challenged. The dog wasn't abandoned. It was positioned for optimal surveillance of a target location. The storm compromised our extraction plan, but the animal was in no real danger. Sarah thought about what she'd seen in the videos, the rows of cages, the training facilities, the systematic surveillance of city officials. Even if Kane was telling the truth about investigating terrorists, the scope of the operation suggested something much more extensive and potentially illegal. "I want to speak to your supervisor," she said, "and I want to see official federal identification." "Mrs. Mitchell, time is running out. We have reason to believe that the terrorist cell we're investigating is planning an attack within the next 24 hours. Every minute that dog remains missing is a minute closer to a potential catastrophe." The weight of Kane's words hit Sarah like a physical blow. If he was telling the truth, if there really was a terrorist threat, then her actions might have put innocent lives in danger. But if he was lying, if this was all an elaborate cover story for an illegal surveillance operation, then she and her family were in immediate danger. In the basement, she could hear Max barking, not the frightened whimpering from before, but the deep, aggressive bark of a dog protecting his pack. Something was happening back there. "Jake!" she called out, but there was no response. Kane's voice came through the door again, but now it carried a note of urgency. "Mrs. Mitchell, my team is detecting movement in your backyard. If you have the dog back there, you need to bring it to the front door immediately. There are other parties interested in that animal, and they won't be as reasonable as we are." Other parties? Sarah's mind raced with possibilities. If there really was a terrorist cell, if they knew Max had been gathering intelligence on them, then they might be coming to eliminate the evidence. Or Kane might be lying, trying to create urgency to force her compliance. Either way, her family was trapped in the middle of something deadly. The barking from the basement suddenly stopped, replaced by an ominous silence that made Sarah's skin crawl. From outside, she heard Kane speaking into a radio. "Perimeter breach detected. Unknown subjects approaching from the east. All units prepare for immediate extraction." The sound of gunfire shattered the afternoon air, and Sarah realized that their quiet neighborhood had just become a war zone. What's the most terrifying possibility? That Kane is telling the truth about terrorists, or that he's lying about everything? Drop your thoughts below. Sarah's world exploded into chaos. The gunfire came in short bursts, professional and controlled, echoing through the storm like thunder. She dropped to the floor, her heart hammering against her ribs as she tried to process what was happening. Through the front window, she could see Kane and his men taking cover behind their vehicles, weapons drawn, returning fire toward the back of her house. "Jake! Ethan!" she screamed, crawling toward the basement stairs. But before she could reach them, her back door burst open. Jake stumbled into the kitchen, carrying Ethan in his arms, with Max pressed close against his side. Blood was streaming from a cut on Jake's forehead, and his eyes were wild with adrenaline. "There were men in the backyard," Jake gasped. "They tried to grab Ethan. Max attacked them. I've never seen anything like it." Ethan was crying, his small arms wrapped tightly around Jake's neck. "The bad men wanted to take me, Mama. They said I was going to come with them, but Max bit one of them, and Jake hit another one with a shovel." Sarah's blood turned to ice. They hadn't just come for the dog. They'd tried to take her son. "Who were they?" she asked, pulling Ethan into her arms. "I don't know, but they weren't with Kane's group. Different clothes, different accents, and they knew Ethan's name, Aunt Sarah. They called him by name." The implications hit Sarah like a freight train. Whoever these new players were, they'd been watching her family for longer than just today. They knew personal details, they'd planned this operation carefully, and they were willing to kidnap a 5-year-old child to get what they wanted. Max positioned himself between the family and the broken back door, his hackles raised and a low growl rumbling in his throat. Despite everything he'd been through, the dog was still protecting them. Kane's voice boomed from outside, amplified by what sounded like a megaphone. "Mrs. Mitchell, you need to get out of that house now. The men who just tried to enter your property are extremely dangerous. We're here to protect you, but you need to trust us." "How do we know you're not working together?" Sarah shouted back. "Because they just shot at my men," Kane responded. "Mrs. Mitchell, these people are part of the terrorist cell I told you about. They know you have the dog, and they're willing to kill your entire family to keep their secrets safe." Another burst of gunfire erupted, this time from multiple directions. Sarah realized with horror that her house was caught in the middle of a 3-way gun battle. Kane's team, the mysterious attackers from the backyard, and possibly more groups she didn't even know about. "We can't stay here," Jake said, looking around frantically. "This place is going to turn into a shooting gallery." "Where can we go?" Sarah asked. "We don't even know who to trust." Ethan, who had been quietly crying in her arms, suddenly looked up with startling clarity. "Max knows," he said simply. "Max knows who the bad guys are." Sarah looked at the German Shepherd, who was still standing guard at the back door. As she watched, the dog moved toward the front of the house, stopped, and looked back at them as if waiting for them to follow. "He wants us to go with Kane," Jake observed. "He's not afraid of those guys." "But he was terrified of something earlier," Sarah said, remembering how anxious Max had been while watching the surveillance footage. "Maybe he was scared of what's on those videos," Ethan said with the simple logic of a child. "Maybe he was scared of the people who made him watch bad things." The shooting outside intensified, and Sarah heard glass breaking in another part of the house. They were running out of time to make a decision. "Okay," she said finally. "We go with Kane, but we stay together, and if anything feels wrong, we run." They moved toward the front door, Max leading the way. The dog's behavior had changed completely. Instead of the frightened, traumatized animal they had rescued from the billboard, he now moved with purpose and confidence, like a trained soldier returning to duty. Sarah opened the front door cautiously. Kane was crouched behind an armored vehicle, speaking rapidly into a radio. When he saw them, relief flooded his face. "Thank God," he said, rushing toward them while staying low. "We need to get you out of here immediately." "Who are those people?" Sarah demanded as Kane ushered them toward his vehicle. "We'll explain everything once you're safe," Kane said. "Right now, the priority is keeping your family alive." As they reached the armored car, Sarah got her first close look at Kane's team. They were definitely professionals. Their movements were coordinated, their equipment was military grade, and they handled the situation with the calm efficiency of people who'd been in combat before. But Sarah's journalist instinct still screamed that something wasn't right about this whole situation. "Get in," Kane ordered, opening the vehicle's back door. "We have a safe house about 20 minutes from here." But before they could enter the vehicle, Ethan suddenly pulled away from Sarah and ran back toward the house. "Ethan!" Sarah screamed. The little boy had spotted something lying in their front yard, a small device that had apparently fallen from one of the attackers. Before anyone could stop him, he scooped it up and ran back to the car. "I got it, Mama," he said proudly, holding up what looked like a high-tech communication device. "The bad man dropped this." Kane's expression changed instantly when he saw what Ethan was holding. "Give me that," he said, his voice sharp with urgency. "No," Ethan said, pressing the device against his chest. "Max says not to." Sarah looked at the dog, who had indeed positioned himself between Ethan and Kane, his body tense and alert. "It's evidence," Sarah said firmly. "If there's really a terrorist plot, the FBI will want to examine it." Kane's jaw tightened. "Mrs. Mitchell, you don't understand the sensitivity of this situation. That device could contain information that compromises ongoing national security operations." "Then we'll turn it over to the proper authorities," Sarah said. "Federal authorities, with proper identification and documentation." For a moment, Kane looked like he might try to take the device by force, but another burst of gunfire from the backyard reminded everyone that they had more immediate concerns. "Fine," Kane said through gritted teeth. "We'll sort this out at the safe house. Everyone in the car now." As they drove through the storm-lashed streets, Sarah studied Kane's face in the rearview mirror. There was something about his expression, a calculation, a coldness that made her increasingly certain that his story about terrorism was a lie. "Tell me about Apex Security Solutions," she said suddenly. "How long have you been contracted by the federal government?" Kane's eyes flicked to the mirror. "That's classified information, Mrs. Mitchell." "Is Victor Cross your boss?" Sarah asked, naming the only person she knew connected to private security firms in the area. Kane's reaction was immediate and telling. His hands tightened on the steering wheel, and his voice became dangerously quiet. "Where did you hear that name?" Sarah felt a chill of realization. Victor Cross was a billionaire tech entrepreneur who'd been the subject of numerous investigations over the years, allegations of illegal surveillance, bribery of public officials, and connections to organized crime. Nothing had ever stuck, but Sarah had interviewed several sources who claimed Cross operated a shadow network of influence throughout the city. "Is this about Cross?" she pressed. "Is he the one behind the surveillance operation?" "Mrs. Mitchell, I strongly advise you to stop asking questions you don't want the answers to," Kane said. But Sarah's investigative instincts were in full gear now. "The dogs aren't for fighting terrorism," she said, the pieces falling into place. "They're for gathering blackmail material on politicians and judges. Cross is building a network of compromised officials he can control." Kane pulled the car over suddenly, the tires skidding on the wet pavement. They were in an industrial area now, surrounded by warehouses and empty lots. Sarah realized with growing alarm that this wasn't the way to any safe house. This was where Kane had been planning to bring them all along. "Jake," she whispered urgently, "be ready to run." But Jake was already moving. The 17-year-old had apparently reached the same conclusion. As Kane turned around in his seat, Jake lunged forward and grabbed the man's weapon, while Sarah threw open the back door. "Run!" she screamed, pulling Ethan from the car. Max burst out behind them, and for a moment, the German Shepherd turned back toward Kane with a snarl that sent ice through Sarah's veins. The dog's training was warring with his protective instincts, and she could see the internal battle playing out in his posture. "Max, come!" Ethan called, and the dog immediately abandoned his aggressive stance to follow the family. They ran through the industrial complex, splashing through puddles and dodging between buildings as Kane's shouts echoed behind them. Sarah could hear other vehicles approaching, reinforcements that Kane had apparently called while they were driving. "This way," Jake said, leading them toward a cluster of abandoned warehouses. His parkour training was paying off as he found paths through the urban landscape that would be nearly impossible for their pursuers to follow. They took shelter in an empty building, breathing hard and trying to process what had just happened. "Kane works for Victor Cross," Sarah said, voicing what they'd all realized. "The surveillance operation, the trained dogs, all of it. It's Cross's private intelligence network." "But why take us?" Jake asked. "Why not just take Max and the evidence?" Ethan, who had been quietly examining the device he'd picked up, suddenly looked up with wide eyes. "Mama, this isn't a phone," he said. "It's got pictures on it, pictures of our house, pictures of me." Sarah took the device and scrolled through its contents, her blood turning colder with each image. The device contained detailed surveillance photos of their family, their daily routines, Ethan's school, Jake's hangout spots. But most disturbing were the files that showed detailed plans for kidnapping Ethan and using him as leverage against Sarah. "They've been watching us for weeks," she breathed. "This whole thing was planned." "But why?" Jake asked. The answer came from an unexpected source. Max had been standing guard at the window, but now he walked over to Sarah and gently took the memory card from the surveillance collar in his mouth. He dropped it at her feet and then sat back, looking at her with intelligent eyes. "He wants us to watch more of the videos," Ethan said. "He's trying to tell us something important." Using Jake's laptop, they plugged in the memory card and scrolled to files they hadn't seen before. What they found made Sarah's hands shake with rage. The videos showed Victor Cross himself, meeting with city officials in secret locations. But these weren't business meetings. They were blackmail sessions. Cross had compromising footage of Councilman Hayes with a prostitute, Judge Morrison taking bribes, Police Chief Williams involved in a drug deal. The surveillance dogs had captured it all, giving Cross leverage over the most powerful people in the city. "He's not just gathering intelligence," Sarah realized. "He's building a shadow government. Everyone in a position of power is either on his payroll or being blackmailed by him." But the most chilling video was the last one. It showed Cross in what appeared to be his private office, speaking to someone off camera about eliminating loose ends. The timestamp was from yesterday, just hours before Max had been discovered in the Billboard. The dog was supposed to disappear, Jake said grimly. They were going to kill him to destroy the evidence, but the storm messed up their plans. And now they know we have everything, Sarah said. Cross can't let us live, because we're the only ones who know the truth about his operation. As if summoned by her words, the sound of vehicles surrounded the warehouse. Through the grimy windows, they could see black SUVs taking positions around the building. Victor Cross himself stepped out of the lead vehicle, flanked by Kane and a dozen other armed men. Even from a distance, Sarah could see the cold calculation in his eyes, the look of a man who had never let anything stand between him and what he wanted. "Sarah Mitchell!" Cross's voice boomed through a megaphone. "I know you're in there. Let's discuss this like civilized people. You have something that belongs to me, and I have something you want, your freedom." "What do we do?" Jake whispered. Sarah looked at her nephew, her son, and the dog who had risked everything to expose the truth. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped in a building surrounded by one of the most powerful men in the city. But they had something Cross didn't expect: the complete truth about his operation, and the courage to fight for what was right. "We finish what Max started," she said quietly. "We make sure the world knows what Victor Cross really is." The final confrontation was about to begin, and only one side would walk away alive. Who do you think has the better chance of surviving? A billionaire with unlimited resources, or a family with nothing left to lose? Sarah's mind raced as Cross's voice echoed through the empty warehouse. They were trapped, surrounded, and facing one of the most powerful men in the city. But, as she looked at Ethan, something extraordinary happened. Her 5-year-old son wasn't cowering in fear. Instead, he was staring out the window with an intensity that seemed far beyond his years. "Mama," Ethan whispered, his voice eerily calm. "Max is showing me something. He's showing me pictures in my head." Sarah knelt beside her son, her heart pounding. "What kind of pictures, baby?" "The bad man," Ethan said, pointing toward Cross. "Max saw him hurt other dogs, lots of other dogs, and he saw him hurt people too. Max remembers everything." Jake moved closer to the window, assessing their situation. "There are at least 12 men out there, all armed. The main entrance is blocked, and they've got the back exit covered too." "But they don't know about the tunnel," Ethan said suddenly, his eyes still focused on something invisible to the adults. "What tunnel?" Sarah asked. "Max knows about a tunnel, under the floor. It goes to the building next door." Sarah exchanged glances with Jake. Ethan had been displaying an almost supernatural connection with the dog since they'd rescued him. But this seemed impossible. "Honey, how could Max know about a tunnel?" she asked gently. "Because he's been here before," Ethan said with absolute certainty. "The bad man brought him here lots of times. Max saw them put other dogs down there when they were done with them." The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. "You mean when they killed them?" Ethan nodded solemnly. Max was supposed to go down there too, but the storm saved him. Cross's voice boomed again through the megaphone. "Mrs. Mitchell, my patience is limited. You have 60 seconds to come out with the evidence, or we're coming in. And I promise you, my men are far less reasonable than I am." Sarah looked around the warehouse desperately. If Ethan was right about the tunnel, it might be their only chance. But if he was wrong, if this was just the imagination of a traumatized child, they would be trapped underground with no escape. Max seemed to sense her indecision. The German Shepherd walked to a section of the warehouse floor that looked identical to every other section, but he began pawing at it and whining softly. "He's showing us," Ethan said. "Right there." Jake rushed over and examined the floor where Max was pawing. After a moment, he found what appeared to be a hidden handle, cleverly disguised as part of the concrete pattern. "There's something here," he whispered. "It looks like a hatch." He pulled on the handle, and a section of the floor lifted away, revealing a narrow tunnel that disappeared into darkness. "Oh my God," Sarah breathed. Ethan was right. But their moment of hope was shattered by the sound of explosions. Cross's men were blowing holes in the warehouse walls, preparing to storm the building from multiple directions. "Go!" Sarah shouted. "Everyone down the tunnel now!" Jake lowered himself into the opening first, then reached up to help Ethan down. Max jumped into the tunnel without hesitation. as if he'd done it many times before. Sarah was the last to enter, pulling the hatch closed behind her just as the warehouse erupted in chaos above. The tunnel was narrow and dark, barely wide enough for an adult to crawl through, but it was dry and stable, clearly professionally constructed. As they moved through the underground passage, Sarah's phone buzzed with an incoming text message. It was from her editor at the newspaper. "Received your voice memo. Police are already investigating Apex Security. Keep yourself safe and keep documenting everything." Sarah felt a surge of hope. The outside world knew something was happening, but they still had to survive long enough for help to arrive. The tunnel ended at another hatch, which opened into the basement of an adjacent building. As they climbed out, Sarah realized they were in the basement of what appeared to be an abandoned office complex. But the space wasn't empty. It was filled with cages. Dozens and dozens of empty dog cages, along with veterinary equipment and surveillance devices. "This is where they train them," Jake said grimly. "This whole operation is massive." Max moved through the space like he was giving them a tour of hell. He stopped at various locations, whimpering softly, as if he were remembering fallen comrades. "How many dogs?" Sarah asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Ethan was quiet for a moment, his hand resting on Max's head. "Max says, a lot. Too many to count. And they're still doing it, in other places." Sarah pulled out her phone and began recording everything. The cages, the equipment, the clear evidence of a massive animal abuse operation. This wasn't just about political surveillance anymore. Cross was running what amounted to a canine concentration camp. But their investigation was interrupted by the sound of voices from upstairs. Cross's men had figured out where they'd gone, and they were searching the building. "Back entrance," Jake whispered, pointing toward a door marked emergency exit. They made their way through the basement, but as they reached the exit, Sarah heard something that made her blood run cold. Ethan was no longer behind them. She turned to see her son standing in the middle of the basement, his hand on Max's head, both of them perfectly still. "Ethan!" she whispered urgently. "We have to go." But Ethan shook his head. "No, Mama, Max says we have to stay. He says the bad man is coming down here, and we have to stop him." "Honey, we can't fight these people. We have to run and get help. But Max says if we run, he'll just move everything somewhere else, and then all the other dogs will die." Sarah looked at her 5-year-old son, who was speaking with a gravity and wisdom that seemed impossible for his age. She realized that somehow, through his connection with Max, Ethan understood the stakes better than any of them. The sound of footsteps on the stairs above grew louder. Cross and his men were coming. "What does Max want us to do?" Sarah asked, making a decision that went against every parental instinct she had. "He wants us to make the bad man tell the truth," Ethan said simply. "He says there's a way to make everyone hear what the bad man really is." Jake looked around the basement and spotted something that made his eyes widen. "There," he said, pointing to a sophisticated communication setup in one corner. "That's live streaming equipment, professional grade." Sarah understood immediately. "We broadcast everything, live, to the internet." "But we need someone to see it," Jake said. "We need an audience." Sarah pulled out her phone and quickly logged into her social media accounts. She started a live video stream and began typing frantically. "Breaking. Exposing massive corruption and animal abuse operation. Billionaire Victor Cross behind illegal surveillance of city officials. Share this now." Within minutes, viewers began joining the stream. Sarah positioned her phone to capture the entire basement while she spoke directly to the camera. "My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I'm a journalist. What you're seeing is evidence of a massive criminal operation run by Victor Cross, CEO of Cross Technologies. He's been using trained dogs to conduct illegal surveillance of government officials, gathering blackmail material to control the city's power structure." The footsteps on the stairs grew closer. Sarah could hear Cross's voice, speaking to his men in low, urgent tones. "He's been torturing and killing animals for years," Sarah continued, panning the camera across the cages. "And now he's trying to kill my family to cover up his crimes." The viewer count on her live stream was climbing rapidly. Hundreds, then thousands of people were watching in real time as she exposed Cross's operation. That's when Victor Cross himself appeared at the bottom of the stairs, flanked by Kane and several armed men. The billionaire's carefully maintained public image was gone. replaced by the cold rage of a man who'd been cornered. "Turn off the camera, Mrs. Mitchell," Cross said, his voice deadly quiet. "No," Sarah said, keeping the phone trained on him. "The world is watching, Mr. Cross. Thousands of people are seeing this right now." Cross's eyes flicked to the phone, and for the first time, Sarah saw uncertainty in his expression. He'd built his empire in the shadows, but now he was being exposed in the harsh light of public scrutiny. "You have no idea what you're dealing with," Cross said. "The surveillance operation was sanctioned by federal agencies. I'm a patriot, protecting this country from terrorists and criminals." "Then explain the animal torture," Sarah said, moving the camera to show the cages again. "Explain why you had my son's school photographed and planned to kidnap him." Cross's composure cracked slightly. "That was necessary security measures." "For what? A 5-year-old boy?" The live stream viewer count had reached 10,000 and was still climbing. Comments were flooding in from outraged viewers, and Sarah could see that news outlets were starting to pick up the story. "Mr. Cross," Sarah said, speaking directly to the camera while keeping Cross in frame, "tell these people about the videos your surveillance dogs captured. Tell them about the blackmail files you have on Judge Morrison, Councilman Hayes, and Police Chief Williams." Cross's face went white. Those were names that hadn't been mentioned in the public broadcast until now. Sarah was revealing the full scope of his operation in real time. "You're making a grave mistake," Cross said, taking a step toward her. "My lawyers will destroy you. I'll sue you for defamation, harassment, and kidnapping," Sarah interrupted. "And animal cruelty? And conspiracy to commit murder?" The viewer count hit 20,000. Major news networks were undoubtedly monitoring the stream now. Cross's empire was crumbling in real time, broadcast live to the world. That's when Ethan stepped forward, Max beside him, and looked directly at Cross with eyes that seemed far older than his 5 years. "You hurt Max's friends," Ethan said quietly, his voice carrying clearly to the camera. "You made them scared, and then you made them go away forever." Cross stared at the little boy, and for a moment, his mask slipped completely. The billionaire, the power broker, the puppet master, he was just a man being confronted by a child who saw through all his lies. "That dog is my property," Cross said weakly. "No," Ethan said with absolute certainty. "Max doesn't belong to anyone. He's free now, and so are we." Max stepped protectively in front of Ethan, and something extraordinary happened. The German Shepherd looked directly at Cross and began to bark, not the frightened whimpering they'd heard before, but the deep, powerful bark of a dog who was no longer afraid. The sound seemed to trigger something in Cross. All his careful control, all his calculated ruthlessness, disappeared in an instant of pure rage. "Shut that animal up!" he screamed at Kane. "Kill it! Kill all of them!" But Kane hesitated, looking at the phone that was broadcasting everything live to tens of thousands of viewers. "Sir, maybe we should—" "Do it now!" Cross shrieked. And in that moment of unguarded fury, Victor Cross had confessed to attempted murder on a live stream being watched by half the city. Police sirens were already wailing in the distance, growing louder by the second. The live stream had reached 50,000 viewers, and Sarah's phone was buzzing constantly with notifications from news outlets wanting to interview her. Cross realized what he'd done. The carefully constructed facade of respectability was gone, destroyed by his own words on a broadcast that could never be taken back. "You've destroyed everything?" he said to Sarah, his voice hollow with defeat. "No," Sarah replied, still filming. "We've exposed everything. There's a difference." The police burst into the basement just as Cross made one last desperate attempt to grab Sarah's phone. But Max was faster. The German Shepherd lunged forward, not to attack, but to place himself between Cross and the family that had saved him. Cross stumbled backward, lost his footing, and fell hard against one of the metal cages. The sound of sirens filled the basement as police officers swarmed the space, weapons drawn. "Victor Cross, you're under arrest," the lead officer announced, reading Cross his rights as the billionaire was handcuffed. As Cross was led away, he looked back at Sarah one last time. "This isn't over," he said. "I have resources you can't imagine. Lawyers, connections, influence." "You had those things," Sarah corrected. "Past tense. The whole world just watched you confess to conspiracy and attempted murder." The live stream had reached 100,000 viewers before Sarah finally ended it. News vans were already pulling up outside the building, and her phone was ringing constantly with interview requests. But all Sarah cared about was gathering Ethan, Jake, and Max into her arms and holding them close. They had survived. More than that, they had won. "Is it really over, Mama?" Ethan asked, his voice small and tired. "The bad part is over," Sarah said, kissing the top of his head. "But the good part is just beginning." Max lay down at their feet, finally relaxed for the first time since they'd rescued him. The dog that had started as a victim had become a hero, and his courage had brought down one of the most corrupt men in the city. In the days that followed, the investigation into Cross's operation would uncover a network of corruption that reached into every level of city government. Dozens of officials would be arrested, hundreds of animals would be rescued from similar facilities, and the city would begin the long process of cleaning house. Sarah's live stream had been viewed over 1 million times within 24 hours, and her story had sparked a national conversation about surveillance, corruption, and the power of ordinary people to stand up to injustice. But none of that mattered as much as the simple fact that they were alive, they were together, and they were free. Max had found his forever home, and in saving him, they had saved themselves. The 5-year-old boy who heard what others couldn't hear had listened with his heart, and that had made all the difference. If you had been in Sarah's position, would you have risked everything to expose the truth? Like this story, share it with everyone who believes in justice. Subscribe for more incredible true stories. And let me know in the comments what you think should happen to people like Victor Cross.